Empathy has become the most celebrated political emotion of the 21st century. Contemporary political figures, from Barack Obama to public figures such as Mark Zuckerberg, talk about empathy as the root of responsible citizenship. Dozens of best-selling books promise to improve the capacity for empathy so that we can have a more civil and equal society, develop better relationships, and succeed in business. Primatologist Franz de Waal was hailed for his discovery of mirror neurons in apes that allow the recognition, attention, and imitation of another's mental states and lead to evolution of emotional processes like empathy and overt behaviors like helping. Introduced and developed in the German language, empathy has not always been seen as a desirable quality necessary for the development of moral, social, or political life. The first German philosopher who engaged with the concept of Einfühlung was the 18th century romantic Johann Gottfried Herder, who talked about the connection between feeling and knowing. Robert Vischer popularized the term in 1893 in his dissertation in the field of aesthetics and advanced the notion that the term literally means feeling into an art object. Theodor Lipps introduced the concept in the field of psychology as the basic capacity to understand others as minded creatures. The word empathy appeared in the English literature for the first time in 1909 when Cornell University psychologist Edward Titchener translated the German word into English, defining it as Lipps had used it. In the United States, Franz Boas relied on the concept of Einfühlung, as developed by Herder, to describe the basis of the anthropological method of ethnography. Only after World War II did empathy come to be understood as a measurable attribute in an individual or group, one that came to be seen as lacking among many non-Jewish Germans during and shortly after the Third Reich. Before the arrival of the word empathy in the English language, sympathy was used to describe more or less the same phenomena of understanding how others feel. But sympathy has a different genealogy in the English intellectual scene, starting in the mid-19th century, with the earliest discussions by the philosophers and good friends David Hume and Adam Smith. Hume used the word as the capacity to read into the minds of others and promoted the idea that sentiment formed the basis of moral action. Smith shared the idea that sympathy is the basis of a moral community and a judgment in that society. But in politics, psychology, and neuroscience over the last couple of decades, scholars and intellectuals seem to deliberately employ the word empathy and avoid the use of sympathy. Despite change in nomenclature, empathy seems to be synonymous with what Hume and Smith meant by sympathy, an emotion akin to compassion. It is the ethical basis for individual action, the moral virtue necessary for proper political action, and the glue that binds communities together. In the last decade, anthropologists have critically explored the role of positive emotions, such as sympathy and compassion, in humanitarian politics. Politics based on triggering good emotions often and disregarding universal rights. Strong evidence shows how this process works in terms of political asylum, charity, foreign aid, and good governmentality. Additionally, scholars have noted that compassion assumes a position of privilege, a tool of neoliberalism. Its roots lie in colonialism. They argue that managing politics with emotions such as sympathy and compassion unites citizens through the particularities of co-suffering and dutiful response, rather than the universality of rights, through the passion ignited by inequality, rather than presumption of equality, and through emotions rather than politics. A corresponding discussion of the political context of empathy has been lacking. To promote a more complex understanding of empathy in its social and political context, without entirely disregarding its moral implications, I follow the lead of recent psychological anthropologists who have turned to earlier discussions of empathy in the German language, especially those of Edmund Husserl. According to Husserl, empathy is the basis of intersubjective experience. It happens when we attribute intentionality to another by putting ourselves in their shoes. Husserl's concept of intersubjectivity has been misunderstood and mistranslated as mutual understanding, starting from the earliest English translations in the 1930s. Husserl often used words such as Wechselverständigung and Platzwechsel. Duranty points out Husserl's locus of intersubjective experience was the possibility of changing places or trading places, not necessarily of mutual understanding. Accordingly, empathy does not mean that we simultaneously come to the same understanding of any given situation, although this can happen, but that we have to start the possibility of exchanging places, of seeing the world from the point of view of the other. The complexity of empathy lies exactly in the fact that even though humans can imagine the possibility of exchanging places and can infer what others might be experiencing from their different standpoints, full access to their experiences is never possible. In Husserl's words, each person has, from the same place in space and with the same lighting, the same view of, for example, a landscape. But never can the other, at exactly the same time as me, have the exact same appearance as I have. My appearances belong to me, his to him. We can always misread someone's emotions, just as we can misinterpret someone's words. How individuals fill in the gap between the experiences of others and their understanding of these experiences is as complex as the original intersubjective connection. Husserl's concept of Paarung, translated as coupling and pairing, gives insights in how this process of filling the gap works. In my work, I focus on Muslim minority Germans, specifically Turkish Germans and Arab Germans, and I'm especially interested in of the accusation that is directed towards them that they do not engage with the Holocaust and they do not show empathy for the Jewish victims. Although there is no consensus about what exactly is wrong about the way Muslim minority Germans and Europeans engage with the Holocaust, recently there has been widely shared public discomfort with it. Newspapers run stories about how Muslim students refuse to attend concentration camp tours and do not engage with the material on National Socialism in history classes. Despite the special programs devoted to non-German citizens and residents, especially to those of Turkish, Arab, and other Muslim backgrounds, such people continue to be accused of relating to the Holocaust memory incorrectly and of not shouldering responsibility for this massive crime. What triggers the strong need to develop Holocaust education programs specifically for the racialized minorities, who are increasingly seen in opposition to European identity? What does the popular conviction that regular Holocaust education cannot generate proper empathy, when translated across ethnic and religious boundaries, reveal about the relation of Holocaust memory education to national identification in Germany? Focusing on instances where the reactions of Muslim minority Germans towards the Holocaust were judged unempathetic or morally wrong, I explore in my research how Holocaust education and contemporary understandings of empathy in teaching about the worst manifestations of racism in history can also at times exclude minorities from the German/European moral makeup in the fold of national belonging. So, returning to 20th century discussions of empathy in the German language, especially as developed by Edmund Husserl, reveals a much more complex and nuanced experience of intersubjective connection. He tells us that establishing an intersubjective connection based on our own bodily experience is the starting point of gaining a perspective about what other persons might be experiencing in their own bodies. According to him, we grasp the other's body as something similar to our own. Unanticipated or unprescribed emotional connections that some minority Germans who have experienced discrimination established with the Jewish Holocaust victims demonstrate that our socially situated experience is central to our window on understanding on others' experiences. When we see a racialized, classed, or gendered individual, especially one who experiences discrimination, we have insight into how they might feel because we each have standing in a society that ranks people in terms of such categories. This sympathy is why, when confronted with reminders of the Holocaust, some Turkish and Arab background Germans fear that they might be victims if something like this were to happen again. Others establish a likeness between their own racialization and that which the Jews express and feel envy that anti Semitism is acknowledged, whereas Islamophobia is disregarded. The unexpected feelings Muslim background Germans expressed during my fieldwork run counter to the expectations of Holocaust education programs aimed at triggering feelings of remorse and responsibility. Muslims expressing feelings outside this framework were judged to be lacking in moral qualities and the capacity to be good citizens. Yet, a Husserlian understanding of empathy shows us that feelings triggered by putting on someone else's shoes start from and end in the shoes one already owns. Hence, an ethnic German and a racialized minority German wearing differently positioned shoes will not feel the same way when they put themselves in the shoes of Jewish Holocaust victims, before eventually returning to their own shoes. However, as long as they swap shoes, they experience strong empathetic connection with the victims of the Holocaust. Even though Holocaust education programs in Germany now recognize that not everyone in Germany is an ethnic German with roots in the Third Reich, many do not acknowledge that a diverse society will generate different legitimate reactions to even the biggest tragedy, the gravest wrongdoing. Ironically, otherwise admirable efforts of coming to terms with the Germany's racist past have also become a mechanism for excluding racialized minorities from the moral field of the German nation. At a time when Holocaust perpetrators and survivors are dying, and German society is becoming increasingly more diverse, German national self-definition continues to be based on a single model of empathic connection towards the victims of the Holocaust. Those who arrived in Germany after the Second World War challenge this approach and show there are many ways to connect with the Holocaust, many ways to infer what its victims might have experienced, and many ways to draw lessons that relate to today. Thank you.